Globalization, as defined by Jan Schotter, refers to the spread of transplanetary and supraterritorial connections between people. By that, he means those connections are beyond transactional and exchange of goods and services across conventional boundaries. People from various parts of the world are integrated within a single social space, planet Earth in this case, and their engagements with one another can be physical, legal, linguistic, cultural, and psychological, unconfined by territorial demarcations. As noted by Amitav Acharya, globalization would also involve non-territorial actors such as multilateral organizations and NGOs. Before looking into migration's impact to the EU, it may be useful to very briefly understand first the EU's existing state of security affairs. Given its economic and trade origin, the EU security architecture has historically been closely connected with NATO and the US. Close cooperation between the two organizations occurred throughout the 1990s to 2018. These include EU-led operations in Europe, example the Balkans, and deployments in Africa and Middle East. The EU has developed its own channels, structures, and capabilities for foreign security and border policy making and implementation. While this might have been variously shaped by events in the region, such as the Cold War, collapse of Yugoslavia, and more recently, annexation of Crimea, the underpinning driver has primarily been to establish a unified set of policies on foreign affairs, security, and free movement of people within the EU borders, even as it underwent challenging expansion to include more member states. A key EU initiative is the Common Foreign and Security Policy. Established since the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, member states undertook to formulate common foreign, security, and defense policies for implementation through the Western European Union. Its current objective is to develop civilian and military capabilities to prevent conflict and manage crises, protect human rights, uphold rule of law and democratic principles. The 1985 Schengen Agreement is a second important program introduced to reduce internal border controls. Currently, this covers 26 EU countries. The common visa-free and asylum policies and policing is adopted. Finally, the European External Action Service emerged from the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007 to provide diplomatic service for the EU. While it is the intent of the EU to achieve solidarity and unity in policy making, in general as well as for foreign and security policies through all these structures, coherence is often difficult to achieve given it is done through a complicated governance, involving multiple agencies and departments from both member governments and the EU institutions, civil society, NGOs, and private sector, etc. Furthermore, while a formal decision-making and legislative procedure exists, it usually also entails a mix of consensus building and consultation. As such, creating an EU consensus has reportedly been seen as challenging, taking the examples from how it managed different issues ranging from Lisbon Treaty reform plans, China Belt and Road Initiative policy, to Russia sanctions. It is against this backdrop that we would consider impacts of the migration crisis on the EU as a security concern. First and foremost, it is important to establish the two opposing perceptions of the migration wave from the northern half of Africa and the Middle East through the Mediterranean into the EU. Some member states and even different parts of the political divisions within a member state view it as a threat to regional national security. Others see it as a human security and humanitarian emergency requiring assistance. Given the reasons cited earlier, having a unified EU collective response is challenging. One of the key contributing factors is the difficulty in distinguishing the mix of legitimate asylum seekers, refugees, economic migrants, and irregular or illegal migrants. The mix of migrants comprises of those desperately fleeing conflicts, persecution, and extreme poverty. Yet, there are also those whom criminal and terrorist organizations have reportedly used to support illicit activities. Globalization, from the perspective of physical flow of people through migration, when managed right, can bring benefits to host countries, particularly in terms of the economy. Authorized migration increases the size of a labor market, which ultimately adds to the productive capacity of the economy. New migrants can also fill labor shortage in growth sectors. However, it is also true that globalization can have negative impacts depending on the political and economic situations and the propensity to integrate migrants into the social mainstream of the host countries. For example, during a period of low economic growth, the typically lower cost of employing migrant workers, whether skilled or unskilled, depresses wages or even deprive competing native workers of jobs. The assistance and rise of right-wing nationalist agenda in the political environment also means anti-immigrant sentiments eclipses the potential benefits that immigrant communities can bring to host countries. In general, forced or irregular migration, which often means working without authorization, are seen negatively as it undermines the sovereignty. The migration issue has also highlighted the strain of coexistence of the Schengen Agreement and the Dublin Regulation. The Dublin Regulation states that entry point country in the EU has sole responsibility in processing asylum seekers' application, and migrants who travel to other EU states face deportation back to the entry country. Many frontline countries have decided to suspend and stop the enforcement of the Dublin rules.
The issue of immigration in the background of globalization is becoming more complex, involving not only economy issues, but also cultural collisions and even awareness issues. Not only traditional security issues such as military wars, ethnic conflicts, and political riots, but also extreme racism and xenophobia, and even non-traditional security issues such as terrorism. The Global Governance of Immigration Issues is an international convention relating to immigration rights in the fields of refugees, illegal immigrants, labor immigrants, human trafficking and smuggling at the global, regional, national, and global civil society levels. Normative framework, consultative dialogue platform, and integrity in governance system of relevant organizations of immigration governance. There are three reasons for the low level of global governance of immigration issues. First, the degree of governance is not deep, and most of them stay on the surface. For example, the consultation platform for immigrants is not mature enough, and there is not much interaction between principal parties. Second, in the area of immigration issues, no international agency is empowered to set standards to ensure that immigrants are protected and enjoy human rights. Third, the signing of the Convention of the Protection of Immigration Rights is not deal. For example, the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all migrants, workers, and members of their families, adopted by the United Nations in 1990, did not enter into force until 2003. At the end of 2018, only 54 countries had ratified it. 39 countries signed it, and mostly were immigrant exporting countries. Taking the EU migration crisis as an example, the global governance of immigration issues faces four major dilemmas from philosophy, law, international relations, and technology. First, at the philosophical level, the issue of immigration itself is a paradox of freedom and security. Second, at the jurisprudential level, international law and domestic law conflict with each other. Third, at the level of international relations, the global governance model characterized by multiple governance subjects conflicts with the national governance model with the sovereignty, supremacy, force. On the technical level, how to identify illegal immigrants and terrorist forces in a large number of immigrants. The essence of immigration issues touches on the core concepts of ancient political philosophy, freedom and security. It also involves a core proposition of international relations, how to conduct effective global governance in the context of an international society with no higher authority than sovereign states. EU migration crisis also reveals the embarrassing status of international law. When soft international law conflicts with the hard domestic law, how to coordinate the relations between two to promote the global governance of immigration. The transactionality, asymmetry, and the difficulty of immigration. The characteristic of non-traditional security such as sex and non-uniformity determine the difficulty of global governance of immigration issues. With the end of the Cold War and the deepening of globalization, non-traditional security issues related to human security and global security have emerged. As security issues are shifting from traditional security to transitional, non-traditional security, governance entities shift from singularity to pluralism, and governance thinking should also be transformed. We must change the concept of immigration governance, taking the value of the life of all mankind as the origin. The global governance of immigration issues can draw on concepts of harmony and difference, integration and rawness to help the global governance of immigration break through the traditional concept of national sovereignty, giving priority to responsible sovereignty based on the value of all human beings. The safety shared by all human beings is the goal. Then establish an immigration governance system. The immigration governance system is a combination of multiple governance entities, ethnic countries, international organizations, international non-governmental organizations, individuals, and regional organizations, with the principle of cooperation and co-construction as the main means to promote a superior coexistence among various subjects. A governance alliance that addresses the short-term goal of a common immigration crisis and enhance the ability of immigration management, respect and protection of immigration rights. Finally, achieve the ultimate goal of safe sharing, establish a sense of comorbidity and coexistence, cultivate common emotions and identity, form a pluralistic co-construction subject, establish shared goals, and finally gain shared security. Through the coexistence of superiority between governance entities, practice and win-win, and finally achieve a good governance model of safe sharing.
The EU and its many political, military, humanitarian and legal bodies have played a hugely significant role in the management of the recent migration crisis. Alongside their respective counterparts at both the national and local level, both inside and outside the EU. This close alignment and integration of states and agencies has allowed for a Europe-wide and in some cases a global approach to protect national, regional and sometimes global security interests. The predominant security threat regionally and globally that has certainly garnered the most press coverage is the migration or perhaps infiltration of extremism-affiliated fighters in response to Western involvement in the so-called Arab Spring. Security agencies and police forces across Europe and beyond, with the support of organisations such as Europol and Interpol, have been required to increase their efforts to both prevent and investigate acts of terror planned or committed by those masquerading as victims of humanitarian conflicts, amongst others. Sharing of information and integration of efforts across boundaries has never been more important, with arrangements such as the Five Eyes Agreement providing vital intelligence in the fight against extremism. The same can be said of the further integration of the military organisations that protect the coastlines of southern Europe, to actively prevent and ultimately rescue those taking part in irregular migration, including close affiliation with non-EU states such as Turkey. Frontex, being the European Union's collective response, integrates resources and equipment of its member states to protect the EU's borders and return those deemed unsuitable for asylum. Resettlement of migrants has required a global approach, with countries such as Canada, far from EU borders, taking in migrants fleeing war-torn North African and Middle Eastern nations. Within Europe, various national governments were required to coordinate to resettle those arriving on the shores of Europe through asylum programmes, which saw many thousands of migrants relocated to EU nations far from the southern nations of their arrival. all of whom, at least initially, placed greater strain on national and local resources such as the welfare state, healthcare, housing and education. As these are seen as key security concerns for the host country's population, this was met with a mixed response from the natives and press, the free movement area or Schengen area being seen as a key appeal for those migrating and a facilitator of almost unchecked migrant movement across Europe. This was seen as a contributing factor to the EU referendum result in the UK in 2016, as the migration crisis was politicised and propagandised for electoral gain. Despite this perception, studies show that migration has a net positive impact due to the likelihood of migrants being of working age, thereby boosting the host country's labour force and driving an increase in real GDP, placing national governments between what is best for a nation versus what its people perceive to be best. Top-level initiatives have been set up in Europe to attempt to deal with the wider issue of migration, such as the Partnership Framework on Migration in cooperation with international partners such as the International Organisation for Migration and the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa and the European External Investment Plan, which are seen as key EU vehicles attempting to solve the migrant crisis at its root across North Africa and the Middle East. These initiatives have not only had the effect of decreasing migration to Europe, but also provided billions of euros to developing nations, worked to stop human trafficking, provided jobs and training for the forces of the countries of origin, thereby improving security in those countries and in Europe. A globalised approach to the migration crisis has allowed and required for close integration of the assets of nation states to ensure that the situation is dealt with holistically, not just delegated to the authorities governing a migrant's route or point of entry. This has enabled Europe as a whole to stem the flow of migrants through positive preventative measures in countries of origin, reinforce the understanding that migrants are welcome in Europe, but only if they follow the proper channels, and place settled migrants in positions where they can actively contribute to society.
The question we've been asked in this final section of the presentation is whether separating out the two levels, regional and global, helps us in understanding the concerns and positive consequences of the EU migration crisis. To answer this question, we will look first at what a regional security perspective brings to our analysis, and then we'll look at a global security perspective. Our argument is that it is a combination of both perspectives that provides the most comprehensive insights, but that it is only by separating them out in the first instance that we can examine what each perspective brings to our understanding. The EU migration crisis began in a localised way among a relatively small number of member states. By taking a regional security perspective, we start to see the impacts that the migration crisis has had on the EU as a whole. It has tested the coherence and commitment of the EU as an institution and the underlying agreements between its member states that it has relied on to manage migration and refugees. A regional perspective illustrates the range of institutional strengths the EU is able to bring to bear, such as security, funding, and social policies supporting integration, both within the EU and among its external relationships. By taking a regional perspective on migration, we have an opportunity to get a clearer sense of whether there is a coherent, collective EU security interest. This is because the migration crisis created security concerns that were economic as well as hard security on a scale that has not previously been seen amongst the expanded EU. Looking at regional security through a globalisation lens is not just about the strengths and limitations of the EU as an institution in responding to the migration crisis. It is also examining how non-state actors within the EU, such as NGOs and business, are part of the response to the crisis. This includes by providing support and opportunity for migrants in a way that helps lessen the burden on the EU's own architecture. It also provides a more nuanced account of what migration means to the EU and some of the positive aspects of the economic, education and future workforce. And looking at the regional level, it is also important to remember that the EU is the most recognised and studied regional entity. Sabragia refers to it as the poster child of regionalism and notes that there is a sense of European exceptionalism about the operation of the EU as a regional concept. So there are assumptions about what the EU is able to do to address a crisis as a regional entity. Through the migration crisis, some of those have been found to fall short. When we look at the regional aspect of the EU migration crisis, it is worth reminding ourselves about other regions that this crisis draws in. The lack of regional strength in the Middle East is a contributing factor to the migration crisis. Andrew makes the case that the Middle East, particularly some of the Arab states and their organisational entities, lack the regional mechanisms to address conflict in Somalia, Yemen or the Sudan. Afghanistan, another source of migrants to Europe, is also a chronically unstable region. So we see that the EU migration crisis is also a product of inter-regional tensions, where one region is much weaker and less able to provide stability and economic opportunity than another region that is reasonably proximate. By adopting a global security perspective on the EU migration crisis, we obtain a broader sense of the factors that drive the migration towards the EU and the numbers that have come to be considered a crisis. In other words, not just the reasons that the EU sees as its points of attraction for migration. A global perspective helps to make sense of the coalescing of factors that have seen the EU become a destination in such high numbers. These include things like transnational gangs and organised crime, which Mugger describes as a product of war, post-war instability and transborder migration, all symptoms of global trends. A global perspective also draws out the role of international organisations in addressing the factors which have created the migration crisis. These include bodies which address development assistance, refugee compacts, resettlement agreements, donor funding, and the UN Security Council. In looking at the EU migration crisis through a global security lens, we also have to ask whether the crisis itself has had an impact on global security, not just its effect on regional security. For example, by demonstrating the commercial viability of migration via organised crime on a previously unseen scale. There are a number of other parts of the globe where organised crime and migration go hand in hand when it comes to ocean crossings. Briefly then, in conclusion, we note that while we have sought to identify aspects of the EU migration crisis by separating regional and global security levels, there are some limitations in this approach. Of course, it is also the relationship between the two levels that explain aspects of migration concerns and their positive consequences. In other words, there are links between global and regional security. The EU migration case study, as we have shown in this presentation, involves a range of issues that were addressed at both levels in order to develop an effective response.